to talk with you about, and as she said, we are being recorded. Again, this is Joe Feldman with Mark Boswell, and we are from Crescendo Education Group, and we're going to speak with you today about grading for equity. Thank you all for carving out some time, and thanks to Challenge Success for inviting us to be part of this. We have presented at the Challenge Success Conference. I think this is our third year, I think. And it's been really wonderful to connect with so many educators who are invested in thinking about their school environments and cultures and communities in ways that Challenge Success is doing and supporting, and to have grading be considered as part of the picture about how do we create more supportive learning environments for students is hugely important. And so it's just we're so grateful to be part of this again. So as you'll see in the agenda, we are going to be taking on a lot of information pretty quickly. And we're going to do an activity pretty fast here after we set some ground rules and some preambles. So here we go. Let's see. Oops. That's Mark and myself. As you may have seen in the bio, I'm a former high school English and American history teacher, and I was a assistant principal and principal of a couple different schools on both the East Coast and West Coast, and director of K-12 instruction in Union City, and have been doing this work around equitable grading since 2013. And I'll let Mark introduce himself quickly.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, or afternoon. I never know if people are East or West Coast. I know Sarah's in New Hampshire, so hey from there. My name is Mark Boswell. I've been working in education for around 20 years in various roles: teacher, coach, assistant principal, and have been working with Joe for about 2 to 3 years now, and have actually been through the process of Challenge Success, and this work that we're going to be talking about today fits squarely into a lot of the work that you'd be doing with Challenge Success. So looking forward to sharing some of that with you.
Great. We are on Twitter, and this is a hashtag to be part of this community and to let other people know that you are thinking about grading more equitably. Sometimes it can feel like you're the only ones trying to do this, but you'll see there's actually lots and lots of educators all over the country who are trying to make their grading more equitable as well. So please join that community. Just wanted to talk about, as I said, and we've been doing this work since 2013 and working with lots of different schools and lots of different contexts. So you'll see that, we worked with traditional public schools and county offices, as well as independent schools, and increasingly actually with post-secondary institutions, as well as organizations that are designed to support schools. And so it's really, when I started this work in 2013, it was just sort of a trickle. We're starting to see this increasing volume of people and institutions who are engaged in the work. So our goals for this quick session are threefold. The first is to just increase the awareness of the history of grading and the impact of those practices in our classrooms today, to give an overview of the pillars of equitable grading and information about one of those practices. And the third is to describe the impact of equitable grading and assessment in a school community, particularly during this very, very challenging time. So I will pass it off to Mark to talk a little more about our session.
Yeah, well, we wanted to make sure you knew what this was not going to be, because a lot of times you come to sessions and you're excited for certain things, but we wanted to make sure that it was clear what we won't be able to do today. This is not going to be a complete and comprehensive training by any stretch of the imagination. We have a little bit of time together today. And I don't know how that translates into, I don't even call them Zoom minutes, they're Zoom years to me. And either it happens like that, or it's like you know, it feels like 27 years later and you're still in the same Zoom session. That being said, there's no way for us to deliver the content to you in this manner. So that's just not going to happen. Reach out to us. We're more than happy to continue talking about that. And it's definitely not going to be some spray on PD. We don't have any magic dust. We don't have any soul glow for you. We don't have any like magic thing that's going to have you walk through this session and come out beautiful on the other side. I'm just kidding. You're all beautiful. But we don't have anything that's going to make you just understand every bit of equitable grading. But what it is, what we will do today is we're going to give you an introduction to the what and the whys of equitable grading, and we're going to give you a couple lenses to use for reflecting on grading practices within your own spaces and challenging your own beliefs. And I pause here for a split second to say some of the things that we're going to say will challenge you, and I want you to just or at least think about what happens when your belief systems are challenged. What are your reactions and things like that? So just be aware as we talk through things. If you're having a reaction, pause and think, why am I having this reaction? And what we definitely want to do is arm you with a vocab to use when you're out talking about grading for equity, because we need to normalize these discussions about grading so that we can better understand, so there's not this stigma of how we grade students and things like that, so we can continually get better at doing that. Oh, sorry. And finally, we're going to give you a smidgen. Like I said, we don't have a lot of time. We're going to give you a smidge of time, space and time to kind of imagine. And a lot of those will come from us asking you questions or asking you to pause for a second. You know, in my classroom, I always said to my kids, pause and have a thought. You don't need to have 20. Pause and have a thought. So we may ask you to pause for a split second and just think about something. Some logistics today. This will be, as you heard, I don't know, we'll name her Jennifer. Jennifer say this meeting is being recorded. This meeting will be recorded so you can check it back out later. Thanks, Jennifer, for that. Please use the chat box for questions and amens. We may, at the speed at which we're going to have to go today, it is hard for us to attend to the chat and respond to questions there. However, we do look at them and try to get to them when we can. But when you hear something that you like us saying, or if somebody else shares something out, we want to build community here as well, and the chat box is one way to do that. So, you know, big up everybody and say what's up. Oh, I just said that. We will use breakout groups shortly at the beginning, just so that you get to see some other faces other than ours, even though, we put on our jackets today, so we know you want to see us for quite some time, but we will let you see some other people for a bit. And we definitely want to make sure that you take care of yourself, right? We do understand that this is a session and it's not that long, but if you need to go off screen because any minute my 2-year-old in a couple days will probably bust in this room because it's her birthday today and scream something, take care of what you need to take care of yourself. When you get in those breakout rooms, please do the following things. Most of you have heard these or done these before. Please share the air. Make sure that you're listening, but also adding to the conversation. Expect and accept that non-closure, and acknowledge and challenge your assumptions. Yep. All right. So what we're going to do right now is we are going to give you a chance to talk about your grading experiences. And what we're going to have you do is we're going to have you pause. Oops, sorry. My clicker, is we're going to give you a free write. And, many of you have done free writes before, but those of you that haven't, just a brief thing on free writes. Basically, the goal is just to sit and write. Don't stop. You can type, you can write, but the goal is to get rid of all those blockages that tend to keep you from freely thinking about a topic or things like that. So even if you don't know what to write and you're in your head is saying, I don't know what to write, type, I don't know what to write, and just continue typing or writing until you get to a place where you're feeling like you're flowing a little bit, right? So what we want you to do is think about a specific experience related to receiving a grade. And it can be either as a student or a parent of a student that was very powerful for you, and it can be positive or negative, right? And while you're doing that, we want you to hold on to kind of the emotional side of this, right? Like what were you feeling in these moments and things like that, and kind of the intellectual side of how is that grading process working for you. So I'm going to stop talking. I took my watch off. So
actually, Mark, could I just interrupt? So just to clarify, so This could be receiving a grade for a homework assignment or a test or a report card, any kind of time when you got a grade. And it could have been from when you were in kindergarten to graduate school. It was just really powerful for you.
Right. No matter how big or how small to you, a powerful grading experience. So we're going to give you that 2 minutes right now, and here you go. You have about 30 seconds remaining. All right, finish that last thought. Right where you are is exactly where you need to be. And I'm going to open up some breakout rooms. And here's what we'd like for you to do in your breakout rooms. First, introduce yourself. Say hey, because it's nice seeing some new faces. I don't know if you're like me and you've been seeing the same faces over and over again. Name, school, role. And if you're a student, welcome and say that you're a student as your role. Your favorite, talk about your favorite, say what your favorite book or what you're currently reading, and share your power. And by the way, share your book, but this isn't like a book talk. We're not going into like the finer points of whatever book you're reading. Just share your favorite book and the author, right? And then take turns sharing your powerful experience. And then think about, again, in this kind of thinking about, what do you notice in or across all of your stories in your groups? And just as another reminder, our norms, please share the air, expect and accept that non-closure, and acknowledge and challenge your assumptions. So we're going to put you in breakout rooms for about 8 minutes. Enjoy. So welcome back, welcome back. Hopefully you had some time to have some great conversation with each other. And what we want to do is get a few more voices in the room. You've heard from Joe and I. You talked to each other a little bit. So we'd love to hear from people about what went on in their breakout room. So yeah, who would like to unmute? Oh, by the way, we also want to make sure there's equity of voice and things like that. So if you feel like you're not somebody who wants to share out in this space, you're more than welcome to throw things in the chat as well, right? So utilize that chat function. Just for sanity's sake, use the little blue hand, or because we're not many pages, you can slowly raise your hand and we can probably see that as well. But use the blue hand function to raise your hand and then we will call on you. So who would like to share out from their group first? All right, I don't see your name, but come on in the water.
Find the blue hand.
It's all good. Oh, Lisa. How's it going, Lisa?
Yes, I'm good. How are you?
Great.
I think what we shared most was in each of our experiences, it was how the individual teacher made us feel that seemed to stick out more than anything else.
Great. So just repeating back, so you're saying the feeling that the teacher, however that teacher made you feel, is the thing that stood out the most for you in your group?
Well, each of us had different experiences. Some were positive, some were negative, but it all centered back around to whether we felt like that teacher cared about us, whether we felt like our learning was important, or we were just being cast aside and, didn't matter. So that seemed to be a constant.
Great, thanks for sharing. Anybody else? Or who would like to go next? Excuse me. I'll buy you some time. There's some things in the chat. Let's see. Oh, some thank yous to some group members. That's so nice. You guys are so nice. Oh, I like this crew. Mahalo. Wow. Yes, the teacher makes a difference, good or bad. So understanding that as educators, we can really shape a student's experience and, dare I say, their identity with how we treat them.
Yeah, I really liked what one of the people in our group, Kristen, said, where her teacher, it was a calculus teacher that did standard-based grading, and kind of just making the point that it didn't matter if you didn't understand it that day, but that you were given second chances to kind of show your learning.
Yeah, Julian, I think.
Yes, Julian. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks, Julian, for that. Yeah, absolutely. The idea of showing students that growth isn't in the one instance, but that there's room to grow with redos and retakes. All right, I think we have time for one more. Who would like to close us out?
I think kind of along that same vein, we talked a little bit about mastery standards-based grading as well. And at the school that I'm at, we have pockets of teachers who are experimenting with that and really diving in. And it's so interesting to see the difference between a traditional grading system and a standards-based approach, because the learning, you can't even compare in both the depth of learning.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'm not going to add anything. I think you did exactly, you closed us out. And which brings us to opening up our discussion today. So I'm going to pass it over to Joe. And we have, all of you know, as educators, as you start sharing your screen, you have to actually announce it so that you can buy yourself some time to do that. So I'm going to do that thing right now, buying myself just a little bit of time. Okay, I think we're good to go. Joe?
Great. I had to unmute myself and say that I'm unmuting myself, even though no one can hear me say I'm unmuting myself. So it was great to hear both from Julian and Angela, I think, about standards-based grading or mastery grading, and people may be at different points in understanding what that is, or in their schools seeing different measures of applying those ideas. And so I wanted to kind of take one step back from that, which is to even talk about, like, why are we, what do we mean when we talk about grading? And I think there's a tendency to say, well, there is so much that we're taking on right now. I mean, we have to design curriculum and think about assessment design and cultural responsive pedagogy, and now we're remote learning. So why try and address grading at this point? Especially because the common assumption about grading is that it's just this very simple thing, and it's just adding up scores earned over points earned over points possible, and we're just kind of calling balls and strikes and using a calculator, and there you go. But we know that grading is a lot more complex than that, because in grading, teachers have to make pretty deep decisions, like, what are the categories I have, and how much are they weighted, and how many points for different things, and what are the scales I use, and what do I do when the work doesn't come in the way I want it to come in? How does that impact the grade, and what do I include and not? Because one of the ironies of talking about grading is that even though it seems sort of on the periphery of things, actually in every pedagogical decision that we make as a teacher, we have to decide, am I going to grade this thing or am I not going to grade this thing? And if I do grade it, with what weight and what consequences? And an irony, and the second irony in this is that when we're trying to think about developing a grading practice as a teacher, we have three sources to draw from: our own experiences, how was I graded, or how have I been grading, the culture in my school. When I joined the school, some department chair gave me some piece of paper probably that said you have to have this percentage weight for something, or the grading software we use makes a lot of decisions for us. And what kind of education I've had and research I've done as a teacher. And a problem is that there is no education that happens for most teachers when they enter the profession around how to grade. It's not in graduate schools usually, it's not in onboarding. Even when you get trained in a new curriculum, they rarely, if ever, mention how to grade the assessments in that. And so most of us, for all kinds of really decent reasons, are just replicating how we were graded. All right, so an idea that if you complete homework, you drop a low test grade just seems reasonable to us, and we do the same thing when we become teachers. And there's a real urgency to talk about grading because we know that grades drive decisions that define our achievement and opportunity gaps. Grades are fundamentally significant in life trajectories of students because we make big decisions about them based on the grades that they have, like who has to repeat or who gets tutoring or who gets to come to the pizza celebration or what track do you get placed in? Do you get to participate in sports or other extracurricular? In a lot of states, including California, you have to have a minimum GPA to get a work permit. And insurance rates are influenced by grades, so family income can actually be implicated by the grades their children get. And of course, all kinds of big post-secondary decisions. And yet, a third irony is that grading is so important and we need so many conversations about it. And yet, if an administrator comes up to a teacher and says, hey, I was wondering if we could talk about grading, what do you think? The first response from the teacher is not, oh, how wonderful that I'm going to be able to address this thorny issue. It is instead, what parent called you and what are you about to make me do? Which is a very reasonable response because with all the mandates and expectations placed on teachers, in many ways, grades are one of the last islands of autonomy that we have. We get to make all kinds of major decisions. It is the one place where we can bring our full professional judgment to our craft and not have it be influenced by other folks. And so we protect it. And so we're reluctant to have this discussion lots of times. And it's just hard even in faculty meetings to come to some agreement. So we're going to show sort of a result of this, of being in this situation. We're going to do a poll, and what you're going to have to do is assign a grade. And so here's the grading scale, very standard in most schools. And we're going to show 3 students, and I'm going to show you 1 student's scores at a time. And we're going to do 3 different polls, 1 for each student, and you're going to tell me what grade you would assign, okay? And so the only other thing you need to know is, besides that these are 5 units, is that the content is somewhat cumulative, which is probably the case in almost every subject. I mean, because you don't just randomly figure out which unit comes first. You put it in some order because there's some cumulative building of some skills or content. Okay, so with that, let's see. Mark, I'm having trouble getting to the screen where I can launch the poll. I'm not sure if it's from the way we're sharing or what, so thank you. So here's the first student. I want you to assign a letter grade, either A, B, C, D, or F to Mark. Fire away. Give you about 10 more seconds. All right, and now, Mark, I was able to manage to find those controls, so I'm going to show you the results. All right, so that's student number 1. Okay, student number 2. I'm going to show you the scores here. Oops, there we go. So what grade would you assign to Denise? Oops, I got to launch the poll. Okay, about another 5 seconds. Don't worry, these aren't real students. There's no consequence to their lives.
Except for Mark's. Why? I mean, come on, y'all.
All right, and now I'll show you the results. All right. And last, let me get you to Joe's. Again, no, these names were just totally random. All right. All right, about another 5 seconds or so. And I want you to assume for Joe that you were an incredible teacher and the school did everything it was supposed to do. And yet, this is what happened. And sometimes it happens, and that's okay. All right, and here are the results. So what you saw was I gave you 5 scores, and even for the first one with Mark, and certainly for Denise and Joe, we had different responses off the same 5 scores. And that is because we have had no training with how to grade. And so we're all doing it somewhat differently, but we're all being really thoughtful and trying to invest our grades with meaning and value and messages about what learning is and what we want to do to motivate students and what we believe is important for lifelong success and what we want our classroom to feel like. We're just all doing it differently because we haven't had this kind of training and opportunity really to learn. Oops. This is from an education historian who talks about how grading is a central feature of nearly every student's, and I would say teacher's, school experience. As such, it can be easy to perceive grading as fixed and inevitable without an origin or an evolution. An effect of this is that despite their limitations, grades are often accepted quite uncritically by all parties involved, and that includes caregivers and families, as well as students. So this is really our opportunity to think about grading differently. Let me get to this. And so I want to sort of give this overall framework that we use to think about how to make grading more equitable. And that's why it's not really just talking about grading, but it's talking about grading to further equity. And I know there's lots of conversations you've probably had at your schools about equity and what it is, but because it's talked about so much, it runs the risk of not meaning much or losing a lot of its meaning. So wanted to share how we think about it, how we think about equity. And so it's our starting point is from recognizing that, excuse me, we work within a legacy of schools that historically have not served groups of students well and have even harmed groups of students. And to be specific, when we say a legacy, that's over multiple generations. And schools are really part of the DNA of our country's history and are interwoven with economics and politics and housing, urban planning, all kinds of stuff like that. And when we say groups of students, it's in particular, it's students of color, excuse me, again, Black and brown students, students whose families have low income, whose first language isn't English, and students who have special needs. We have not served those groups of students well over many generations. And what that has looked like is that those groups have been denied or excluded from accessing certain aspects of our schools. like high quality teaching or rigorous curriculum, or even aspects of schools beyond the classroom in receiving some dignity of their voices, and a sense that they are included in the school. And so what that has done is make it so that we can, with a high degree of confidence, predict outcomes of students academically based on those characteristics. And none of us, I'm going to make the assumption, even though I don't know you all, that we didn't go into this profession so that we could simply replicate the historical disparities in achievement. And so what that requires is us to really think about what are the reasons why this continues to happen despite our best efforts. And I look to this quote, which is that all organizations are perfectly designed to get the results they get. I would argue that we have these disparities in achievement and opportunities because they are actually built into the system. Our schools are over a century old, and they were not designed to have all kids be successful. In fact, they were designed to exclude many kids or to obliterate certain cultures and communities. And so we need to consider that the great way that we grade, because it is part of this 100-year-old system, it actually may be perpetuating, it actually is perpetuating achievement opportunity gaps without us even recognizing it, because it is rewarding students with privilege and punishing those without, and impeding and preventing students with less privilege from being successful. And this is a pretty radical idea, that grading, which seems so innocuous and just like, you know, a bunch of formulas, actually would be wreaking this kind of damage to our students. But it will take us to re-examine these foundational elements of our system, particularly grading, to get different results. And so the framework that we use is really relying on this by Professor Bettina Love out of University of Georgia, who talks about how we have to save education. We have to bring our full selves and our critical eye to making our schools better. So our framework for equitable grading has three parts. That grades are accurate reflections of a student's academic performance, that the grades are bias resistant, which is counteracting institutional biases and preventing implicit biases from infecting the grade, and that grades motivate. They build students' intrinsic motivation and sense of efficacy. And there's a whole lot packed in this. And like Mark said at the beginning, we are not going to address all these things comprehensively. But what Mark is now going to do is share with you one traditional practice and the alternative, more equitable one, and explain how it's more equitable in each of these three ways.
Yeah. So here we go, team. Are y'all ready? I mean, it's a wild ride, so just, you know, hold on. I'm just kidding. All right, so we're going to do an example of equitable grading. And before we do that, though, I want you to think about your role, your personal role in kind of deriving a grade and where that comes from. And a lot of times, and I say your role, and I don't mean you specifically, I mean us as educators, but a lot of times educators, we like to say, you know, the grade is separate from us, right? It's what the numbers say. Like we deliver the grade, the student does the work, the numbers kind of come together and do some magic, you know, whatever, and out comes the grade, right? And that those calculations are more objective, right? If I'm delivering judgment, I have all these biases and things like that, but math calculations, well, those are objective. And hopefully what you're doing is you're starting to feel a little uncomfortable by me saying that, because what you're saying is we are removing ourselves. That you should feel the problem with that. We are removing ourselves away from something because we don't want to be involved in that space. And that should tell you that something is off in our traditional grading practices. And so we want you to think about that our grades are calculated not by how our software programs, I mean, if you're using Excel, if you're, you know, putting it in you know, a lot of our schools have software programs where we just put the grades in and things like that. We still own those grades. Like we still are choosing how they are calculated and how the software calculates them. So we want you to pay attention and make sure that you recognize that we aren't removed from our grades. They are a part of us, and that we are responsible for how they are calculated for our students. So Joe and I have done a little bit of talking for some time. So we want to break this up a little bit and give you some time to think. Remember this kind of pause point. What we're going to do is we're going to share a article with you talking about using the most recent performance. And Joe just threw that in the chat. And while you're reading that, we're going to give you 5 minutes to just hold on to the thoughts of like what is resonating with you. And if you want to jot things off to the side or kind of keep mental note, and then what kind of questions are raised for you. Keep those things in your mind as you're reading this, but we're going to give you 5 minutes of some silence and some, not us talking time for you to read that document. So go ahead and do that now, and your 5 minutes begins right now.
And please don't sign off.
You have about 2.5 minutes remaining. About 1 more minute remaining. All right, start wrapping up that last little bit of reading. And we are back, everybody. All right, so hopefully you had a little bit of time to, at least skim through that article and read a bit. And now what we want to do is actually talk about that kind of common grading practice that we have used. And we're going to talk about, currently what we're going to do is we're going to take averaging performance over time. And we're actually going to use the 3 pillars that Joe talked about a little bit ago and kind of break it down and see where does the accuracy and the bias resistance and the motivation fall in this space, and give you some more equitable practices. So let's just go down a ride with me. So let's start with the unit of study, a persuasive essay unit, right? And in this unit of study, each lesson kind of builds on the previous one, like Joe said, leading the student to gain the necessary skills to write a great persuasive essay by the end, right? So we have our first student, Maria, right, who comes in doing very well, staying pretty consistent with her scores. Sorry, hold on one second. And over the course, she's done pretty well, right? And she's just such a good student, right? And then we have our next student, Ellis, right, who starts off slow, but pulls himself up by his bootstraps and works his way to an A on the final essay, showing that with the help of a great educator like yourself, by golly, he can just write an essay by the end of the unit, right? Can y'all feel me like setting the trap? Okay, so here we go, right? We have averaging over time, and the way that would look graphically is here we got Maria going, on her trajectory, and then we have Ellis, right? And what we would traditionally do, right, is take that performance over time, right, and average her score out to be an A, right? Makes sense. Everybody's like, okay, yeah, of course, right? And the same thing for Ellis, right? And you average that out, and what happens is Ellis gets a C plus. Now, hopefully, I didn't give you a lot of time to look, but maybe you notice that there's a red flag here and brings up a problem, right? Because while Ellis got a C plus when we average out his performance, Ellis never actually scored a C plus on any of his assessments or any of the essays. So already what we have is a descriptor of Ellis's performance that he never actually performed. He never performed at a C plus level. And we're compiling all of those grades and doing some magic in the space. And then all of a sudden what we do is we end up with a descriptor of Elvis's mastery of the content that he never actually performed at. So we need to make sure that our grades are accurate reflections of a student academic performance. And I just showed you that in that instance, that is not an accurate representation of Ellis's performance, right? So here's the more equitable practice, is actually only including the most recent performance, right? And what that means is that we would look at this time period here and recognize that by the end of the unit, especially because it was cumulative the whole time, Ellis is actually performing at an A level. So Ellis actually is showing mastery of the content and should receive the grade of an A. Right, let's look at making sure that our grades are bias resistant, right? So we're going to use averaging over time and looking at bias resistant. We want to make sure that our grades are bias resistant and they counteract the institutional biases and prevent our implicit biases from infecting our grades. And right now what we're going to do is we're going to hone in on institutional. I think, implicit biases, that's for another conversation. We're going to hone in on institutional because I think it's something that we are thinking a lot about right now and how that looks. So we're going to start with a foundational definition that we can all work from. So institutional bias is when the procedures and practices, right, of the institutions operate in ways that favor one group and disadvantage another group, right? It's not the person or the people, it's the actual systems and structures that are perpetuating these inequities, right? And a way to think about that is, there are racist acts that do happen, but a lot of those acts come from the structures that are built around them that push people into these spaces. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about the structure and the systems that are built in place, in our traditional grading system is one of them, that are creating these inequities in our spaces. So we want to counteract those institutional biases by making sure that our grading practices don't reward those students who have resources or time or extra support, and definitely not, we don't want our grading practices to penalize students without those privileges. But we do want to be thinking about how can we get our practices in a way that recognizes that support, that we want our grading practices to support students with weaker backgrounds and education and things like that. and who have fewer supports, and not because of them, because of the systems that are around them, right? And grades that understand that some of our students have had a very negative experience, not only with schools, but with tons of systems that lean on them in ways that don't lean on other students, right? And outside of that, create levels of trauma that students are trying to navigate. And we don't want our grades to add to that space, right? So again, we're going to talk about averaging over time. So what are the institutional biases that could be embedded in averaging performance over time, right? You're thinking like where are these structures, right? Well, we talked about the beginning of the unit to the end of the unit. We looked at Maria and Ellis, but it would be interesting if we could draw the timeline back a little bit before Maria or Ellis got into your class, or the start of that unit, right? So let's pretend that that first unit was the very first unit you gave, and we're looking at the previous summer. And so we're meeting Maria in the summer, or seeing Maria's story in the summer. And oh, look, Maria didn't actually start off understanding how to write a persuasive essay. During that summer, right? We can fill in the story. She went to a camp. She had parents who were English teachers who sat with her every day because they had the time, right? Maria's family may have had extra resources for Maria to then go practice that skill outside of your space, and then enters your class in a place where you never see Maria's learning, right? Or you don't see this kind of formative learning that's happening here, and she enters your class, continues on, and you give her an A, which then means we are, we are saying that this time outside of school, or excuse me, outside of my class is valued, and so that you get that A. So let's look at Ellis, right? Maybe Ellis doesn't have those resources, right? Maybe Ellis had to get a job over the summer. Maybe Ellis had to take care of a sibling. Maybe Ellis's family, maybe Ellis just had a summer, as a kid tends to do, and didn't go or wasn't forced into some other camp, right? But the idea is that those additional resources weren't there for Ellis. So Ellis enters your class, and as any good educator, well, in my opinion, any good educator can say, is you got to see Ellis's learning, and what an awesome thing to have Ellis in your class with actually understanding how to write that persuasive essay, right? But what we end up doing is averaging that performance over time. All of those formative experiences go kind of mushed into the grade, and we end up giving Ellis that C. So you can see how the extra resources that Maria received prior to entering your class has allowed Maria to stay at this A level and Ellis to receive that C+. So the next question is what about the motivation piece, right? We're constantly thinking of ways to make our grades to motivate our students to want to learn, right? We want to build that intrinsic motivation within our students. So let's look at this trajectory again, right? Now, I'm just going to say one thing. This is a beautiful story, right? Ellis got in there, listened, worked hard, did everything, may have got dinged at the front, but we know that a lot of the times what happens is when that student receives that early grade, what ends up happening, in fact, is that early grade actually demotivates them. It doesn't motivate them. And a lot of teachers have said, well, I'll give them the low grade and it will motivate that student to work harder. But I'm just here to say that there is no actual evidence that shows that if you give a student a low grade, that they will be motivated to work harder, right? So what our traditional grading system can do is actually demotivate, do the exact opposite of what we're trying to do for students by giving them that, by showing them that we're going to average out over time. They see the hill, right? They hit that first bump and they recognize no matter how hard I work, even if I get to that A, I still end up with a grade that doesn't actually show my knowledge. So you see that kind of tanking curve, right? So this isn't just Joe and I talking about this. There's plenty of research out there talking about how motivation works with students and grades, right? So I love this quote. Each failure by a student confirms what they already know about the task, that they can't do it. And that's not what we want our traditional grades to say or to do, right? And instead of prompting greater effort, low grades can actually often cause students to withdraw from learning, right? As opposed to getting excited and wanting to continue to learn. So we need to think about kind of how we're giving feedback and those sorts of things, because what we end up saying is that we talk about mistakes to our students all the time. and it's about how we're talking about them. We actually believe that mistakes are good, right? As educators, we want them to have space and time to make those mistakes that are necessary to learn something. You know, you just heard me talk about my daughter's birthday. Well, I just baked a cake, right? And I had to practice some tools and things like that in order to get the cake where I needed it to be, right? And I needed those practice cakes in order to make my daughter's cake today, right? But our traditional grading practices actually contradict that message, right? So what ends up happening is we are again demotivating students when we're putting in all of those formative grades and measuring their mastery of a skill over that time period, right? And then the next question is, what would happen if, oh, excuse me. And then as we get here, we see what we really should be doing is saying, hey, Ellis, you know what, you did do the work, you did pay attention, and you did, well, excuse me, you did learn along the way and take the feedback and use that feedback in order to move forward so that by the end of the term, you did write an incredible persuasive essay and you have learned the content and mastered that skill. All right, and what that helps us do is not allow growth mindset to be a talking point. And you know what happens when we have these buzzwords and buzz phrases like growth mindset, they get warped over time. And I think a lot of people have been using lately growth mindset as a way to say, oh, well, all we have to do is make sure that students just think that they can do this, that they can think and they can just, as long as they work hard and they can do it. But what we're doing is showing them the exact opposite, right? So if we shift our grading practices, we actually build in that piece of students actually being able to have a growth mindset and understand that those mistakes are learning blocks and steps in order to get where they need to be. So we've talked a little bit, but I like to have some student voice in the room, right? So we have one kid started late in class and was scoring low and was playing catch up. And for the first time, I was giving him hope that he could still pass, right? And I don't know how y'all are feeling about the world right now, but giving anybody some hope right now feels like exactly the work we should be doing. And it makes a huge difference when you have kids who have hope in the classroom. They don't give up and it changes the dynamic of the classroom. And again, this is what we should be instilling in students is that level of hope that they can and they should and they will, right? So there you go. We got our 3 pillars right there. But what we don't want to do is just leave you with just that one. There are other equitable grading practices that we will, in a much longer session, or if you want to reach out to Joe and I, we can talk about. So here's some additional equitable grading practices. We do not want our grades to include kind of that 0 to 100% scale because there are some major inaccuracies in using a 0 to 100 scale. Not including participation and other student behaviors in your grade, that you'll slip into some bias areas there. You don't want to be grading performance on homework or any sort of formative assessment, right? Those building blocks, we want students to be able to do that. And giving a group grade, and just quick side note, that was the thing, that's the very first practice that I shifted was giving a group grade and giving extra credit. But some things that we do want to make sure you do is that your grade is based only on academic performance, right? We want explicit learning outcomes, and that goes to using things like rubrics and standard scales, which I saw somebody talk about earlier, how they had a little bit of anxiety in the chat, a little bit of anxiety, but they started going to rubrics and standard scales. Utilizing retakes and redos in your classes and reducing some of the stress there, going to a 0 to 4 scale, and expanded use of formative feedback, right? So when we're saying don't grade certain things, don't add grades over that averaging over time. What we're not saying is, excuse me, we want you to give feedback. Continually give students feedback, please. So that being said, while we're talking kind of large and at 30,000 feet, what we definitely want to do is meet the moment that we are right now. So I'm going to pass it over to Joe to talk it over about the challenges and possibilities while we're in COVID land.
All right, and there are some questions that came up during the chat, including like, how do you then put this into your grade book? Like, do you overwrite, or do you sort of have multiple grades and then you replace all of the earlier ones, or do you actually replace an earlier one? So those are great questions, and teachers do it lots of different ways. There was also the question of what if the trajectory goes down? And in that case, it's really worth figuring out what is the best descriptor, the most accurate description of that student's level of mastery. If the student knew the first unit because it was all review, and then they didn't know the complexity with which you were addressing at the end, then you would be more likely to want the grade to be accurate, right? The problem is we don't want to just take a bunch of numbers and collapse them together through something like averaging, because it never gives us an accurate description of the student's level of mastery. And there are many more questions, and I'm sure like you're now thinking of additional ones, like, well, what happens if the units aren't similar? Or what happens if I've got some things that spiral and some things that don't? Great questions. This is just the very beginning. We don't have much time, so I want to go and talk about a few other things. It would be silly if I didn't make some reference to the fact that we're in the middle of this very traumatic and challenging time for many of us and our students. And there are challenges with improving grading anyway, including our own prior experiences and beliefs about students and ourselves, the dynamics we have in our schools, the implications of changing the way we grade, right? If I no longer average, I have to then grapple with the idea that I did average for students before this year, and who might I have been hurting by doing that? I've got to think about how to engage and educate families. I've got to think about my gradebook software. Can I actually do I have control of changing some of the defaults? And during this time, a lot of people have asked me, well, gosh, I mean, should we try and address grading now with all these other things? And other people say, no, actually is the exact time we should do it, because if we don't talk about grading more deeply during this time, we're going to think about like, well, what is pandemic grading? And then in a year from now, we'll be like, okay, that's all done. We have no more pandemic, so now we don't grade differently. And I would argue that because of the multiple stressors that are on our students now, from the coronavirus to having to learn remotely, particularly for our Black students and other students of color the violence perpetrated against them that has been ongoing is now much more in the public eye and public discourse. Like, we now can see much more clearly how the traditional grading structures were inept at really addressing the right way to grade our students. And so this is the opportunity to reimagine and rethink how we grade. And when we're asked like, oh, well, then how should we grade during the pandemic? We should grade equitably, because once we're done with the pandemic, we'll still be equitably grading. Actually, Mark, could you skip to the next slide, 75? Just for time's sake. Or do I have to do it?
That's 75.
Oh, so oh, yes, it is. Sorry. So what we're talking about is a grade not including things like non-academic performance, right? You can't see through the computer. You can't give a student participation points because you don't know what they're looking at anyway. And maybe we never should have been trying to manage and evaluate student behaviors. We don't want to include formative performance in the grade, but we do want to include how they do at the end of their learning, regardless of the path they took, and have lots of opportunities for them to demonstrate that learning and really leverage feedback and think much more expansively about assessments. If our goal is to accurately describe student performance, we have to think all the different ways that we might access what's in students' heads so that we can accurately and equitably report that. And so how would we start doing this in a school? And some folks talked about earlier how they've had some people in the school start thinking about grading differently. And wherever you are is the perfect place. So some things, the one thing you should not do is you should not, particularly if you're an administrator, you should not say, oh, you're right, we shouldn't average, or we shouldn't use the 0 to 100 scale or whatever, and then go back and announce on Monday, guess what, we're not gonna do averaging anymore, or we're not gonna use the 0 to 100. You know what happens when you do that, right? Teachers will say, sure, sure, and they'll do whatever they want, or you'll just get them angry. And for all the right reasons, because they won't know why, and grading is something that is part of their own professional identity, rightly so. And so you'll just create lots of confusion. So instead, we need to think of ways to bolster the education and research leg of this stool. And we can do that in different ways, from having a book study, an article study, or developing a PLC, or starting to gather information from students on their experiences, or work with other folks. You know, sometimes you can't be a prophet in your own land. And ultimately have ways where the administration is helping a tailwind and a backstop for teachers to start learning, investigating, and exploring and trying the different practices. And so I just wanted to very quickly give a snapshot of the kinds of things that we've seen. Our organization we've worked with dozens and dozens of schools, hundreds of teachers, and thousands of students. And what we have seen across different environments, whether they be post-secondary, elementary, middle, high, urban, suburban, rural, independent, charter, traditional, is that we find that there is reduced grade inflation because students who were having inflated grades because of a lot of non-academic things or because of their resources being rewarded are no longer getting that inflation. And at the same time, we reduce grade deflation for all the converse reasons. And so we've seen a reduction in achievement disparities, particularly for the historically underserved groups. I'll move on to this. I'm moving quickly. So we hear from teachers and talk with students about their motivation increases, especially when they don't do well or have struggled in the subject. And they are less stressed and they stop talking about points. And their relationships with teachers get a lot stronger, actually, and more productive and trusting. Teachers talk about how there is a lot of disequilibrium in trying to do these things. How in the world am I going to not average? It's very difficult, and there's all other kind of emotions that come up. But ultimately, they have a lot more confidence in their grading because they're speaking from a more educated foundation. And they actually end up having a lot fewer arguments with students, and there's less haggling, and they find that they're spending now time thinking about curriculum instruction and not just, I've got to put down 5 participation points every day. This is a quote that I think is really representative of a lot of what we hear. This challenges what I've learned to do as a teacher in terms of what I think students need to know, what they need to show back, and how to grade them. It feels really important, messy, and really uncomfortable. It's, oh my gosh, what have I been doing? I don't blame myself because I didn't know better. I did what was done to me. But now I'm in a place I feel strongly I can't do that anymore. I can't use grading as a way to discipline kids. I look at what I've been doing and I have to do things differently. And what happens as schools go through this process over months and even years is that they end up having some consensus among the teachers. So now policy starts getting driven from the ground up rather than from the top down. And it takes longer, but it's a deeply embedded set of beliefs and practices that now can outlive whatever administrator happens to come into the building. As one of the last quotes, I'll leave you with what Jaime said. And finally, we don't have time for questions, but again, this is just the very, very tip of a very deep, deep, deep iceberg, and hope that this has helped to normalize the conversation and giving you some ideas and possibly some next steps for all of your work. So we want to thank you for your time, and please reach out to us with additional questions and find us on Twitter. So let's see, I'm trying to stop.
Thank you. I can, this is Sarah from Townsend. Thanks, Joe and Mark, that was awesome. And in the hashtag workshop channel, fall workshop, are some articles that Mark and Joe made available to you that they're pinned to the top. So you can grab them. And you have a little passing period now, 15 minutes. So I think you're due in your next, whether it's coaching or another session at 12:05 Pacific. So thanks again, Joe and Mark. It was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you all. So good seeing you.
Thank you.